My name is Linda Carver. I am 77 years old. I have lived long enough to know that life doesn't always fall apart in explosions or car crashes or fires. Sometimes, it unravels in silence. Sometimes, it breaks you in the very place where you are told to be still. For me, it was at a funeral. I was only 13 the day my family gathered to bury my grandfather. He had been a towering man, a World War veteran, the kind who carried the weight of his world in his shoulders and expected everyone else to fall in line. The funeral home was crowded that morning. Heavy velvet curtains framed the windows, the air thick with the smell of lilies and floor polish. The old organ droned out hymns that made my throat tighten. I remember sitting in the front row, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Everyone wore black, and the silence between the songs felt heavier than the prayers themselves. People dabbed their eyes with tissues, whispered condolences, cleared throats. And then my Uncle Gerald slid into the seat beside me. He was my father's brother, a man who seemed larger than life in the eyes of everyone around him. He laughed loud, slapped backs hard, told stories that filled entire rooms. To the town he was charming. To me he was unsettling in a way I could never explain. He smiled too long. He stood too close. And that day, in the hush of grief, his presence felt suffocating. As the pastor spoke, Gerald leaned close. His arm pressed against mine, heavy and deliberate. I shifted, trying to inch away. He leaned closer still. His hand brushed my knee, lingered. My entire body went rigid. Froze. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't kindness. My heart pounded against my ribs, and for a moment I thought I might faint. The pastor's voice blurred, the mourner's sobs faded. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the soft, deliberate sound of my uncle's breath beside me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove his hand away. But the room was full of bowed heads, clasped hands, whispered prayers. Grief hung so thick that my own voice felt trapped beneath it. And then I saw her. My Aunt Margaret. She was seated just across the aisle, her black hat tipped low, a tissue pressed to her lips. But her eyes were on me. On me and Gerald. I knew she saw. My chest tightened with relief. Surely she would intervene. Surely she would stop him, protect me, say something. But she didn't. After the service, as the mourners shuffled toward the exit and I tried to slip away, Margaret's gloved hand caught my wrist. Her grip was firm, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Not a word, Linda," she whispered. Her eyes were hard as glass. "This is a funeral. Keep the peace. Keep the peace." The words sliced deeper than Gerald's hand ever could. My stomach lurched, my throat closed, but no sound came out. My aunt adjusted her hat, smoothed her skirt, and walked on as though nothing had happened. I stood there, trembling, surrounded by people who claimed to love me, people who claimed to love my grandfather. No one noticed my wide eyes, my shaking hands, my silence that screamed louder than any sob in that room. That was the day everything changed. Because in that moment, I understood. My family cared more about appearances than truth. More about peace than protection. More about silence than justice. And I swore to myself, as I stood in that suffocating funeral home, that their silence would not last forever. They thought keeping the peace meant burying me with my grandfather that day. But they were wrong. They had buried something else instead. Promise. My promise. That one day, I would make them hear me. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. When I look back now, nearly 7 decades later, I see the cracks were always there. They ran through my family like fault lines beneath a polished surface. Hidden but waiting. The funeral only split them open. Before that day, I thought my family was solid. Not perfect, but close enough. We had Sunday dinners at Grandma's house. Cousins playing tag in the yard while the adults drank coffee and swapped stories. My father and Uncle Gerald laughed loudest, brothers who seemed to hold court wherever they stood. My Aunt Margaret was always neat, always controlled, her lipstick perfect, her voice smooth as syrup. She never raised her tone, never let a strand of hair fall out of place. To me, she seemed like the very definition of grace. She kept the peace, or so I thought. As a child, I idolized them. Family meant safety. That's what we were taught in school, in church, in storybooks. Blood was thicker than water. Family was forever. But family can also be the first place you learn betrayal. I was 9 when I first noticed Gerald's attention lingered too long. It was at a barbecue, the kind where the air smelled of charcoal and laughter rolled easy. I was helping my cousin carry plates to the picnic table when Gerald crouched beside me, his hand brushing my shoulder. "You're growing up fast, Linda," he said, smiling in a way that made my stomach tighten. "You'll be breaking hearts soon." I laughed nervously, unsure why the compliment unsettled me. My father chuckled from across the yard. My Aunt Margaret, standing nearby, heard it too. Her eyes flicked to me, then away, as if she hadn't heard at all. I told myself it was nothing. Just words. Just teasing. But the cracks were already forming. By 11, I began to notice how silence worked in my family. When Gerald drank too much and grew sharp with his words, people chuckled and said, "That's just Gerald." When Margaret's lips pressed thin but she said nothing, people called her dignified. When my father turned a blind eye to his brother's temper, people praised him for not stirring trouble. And when I once tried to tell my mother that Gerald's hugs lingered too long, she patted my hand gently and said, "Don't be dramatic, Linda. He's family." Family. The word that shut doors. The word that silenced me long before Margaret's gloved hand clamped around my wrist at the funeral. Looking back, I see how that word was used like a chain. It bound us together, yes, but it also tied our tongues. It kept us quiet when we should have spoken. It made betrayal possible. And that's why the funeral cut so deep. Because the cracks weren't new. They had always been there, beneath the polished surface of my family's smiles and Sunday dinners. I can still remember the night before the funeral. I was in my room, brushing my hair, when Margaret came in. She smoothed my black dress against my shoulders, adjusted the bow at my waist and whispered, "Tomorrow, hold your head high. Don't cry too loudly. Don't embarrass your father." Her words weren't cruel exactly, but they carried weight. Appearance mattered more than grief. Control mattered more than truth. So, when she told me to keep the peace at the funeral, I shouldn't have been surprised. That had been her lesson all along. Keep quiet. Keep neat. Keep silent. But that day it was different. That day, silence wasn't just a lesson. It was a command that carved itself into me. Because I knew then, in my family, peace was never about love. It was about hiding cracks. And I swore, as the days passed after the funeral, that I would no longer help them hide. I began to watch differently. I watched the way Gerald's laughter never reached his eyes. I watched the way Margaret's hand tightened on her handbag whenever his temper rose. I watched the way my cousins looked down at their plates when Gerald barked orders. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. And everyone stayed silent. That silence was the crack that ran deepest of all. And I knew, sooner or later, it would swallow me whole if I didn't fight back. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. The day of my grandfather's funeral is etched into me like a scar that never fades. Even now, at 77, I can smell the lilies wilting in the vases, hear the shuffling of black shoes on polished floors, feel the suffocating weight of grief pressing on my chest. Funerals are supposed to be about family coming together. About remembrance. About love. But for me, that day was the moment my world shattered. Not because I lost my grandfather, but because I lost my trust in everyone who should have protected me. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped in my lap, eyes fixed on the coffin draped in the flag. My heart pounded, not only with sadness but with something else: dread. I felt it before I even saw him slide into the seat beside me. Uncle Gerald. The man everyone admired. The one who made people laugh with his booming voice and endless stories. To the outside world, he was charming, dependable. But I knew better. I had always felt uneasy when he was near, though I couldn't explain why. That day, sitting beside me in the quiet of morning, his presence became unbearable. He leaned close, his cologne mixing with the floral air, suffocating me. His arm pressed against mine, heavy and deliberate. I tried to inch away, but the pew held me tight. Then his hand brushed my knee, lingered, pressed in a way that made every muscle in my body lock. My breath caught. My skin crawled. I stared ahead, terrified to move, terrified to make a sound. The pastor's voice blurred, words about heaven and peace floating uselessly through the air. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove him away. But fear froze me. And around me, bowed heads and clasped hands told me that no one was watching. Except Margaret. Across the aisle, my aunt's eyes locked on me. I knew she saw. Relief surged through me, hot and desperate. My body screamed for her to stand, to speak, to stop him. She was the adult. She was family. She would protect me. But she didn't move. Her eyes lingered for one long, unbearable moment. Then she looked away. I swallowed hard, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The pastor's words faded into a drone. The mourners dabbed their eyes. And my uncle's hand remained, an iron weight that branded shame into me. When the service ended, people rose slowly, filing past the coffin to pay final respects. I slipped out of the pew, desperate to breathe. My knees shook as I pushed through the crowd, my chest tight, my eyes searching for escape. That's when Margaret's hand caught my wrist. Her grip was firm, gloved fingers digging into my skin. Her face was composed, her black hat tipped just so, her lipstick perfect. To anyone watching, it was a picture of maternal concern. But her voice, low and sharp, was something else entirely. "Not a word, Linda," she whispered. "This is a funeral. Keep the peace. Keep the peace." 3 words that sliced through me like knives. My throat closed. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced them back. Margaret released my wrist, smoothed her skirt, and walked on, joining Gerald at the door. Together they greeted mourners, shaking hands, nodding solemnly, smiling the kind of smiles that hid everything. I stood alone in the aisle, trembling, the air around me thick with perfume and sorrow. No one noticed my pale face, my shaking hands, the way my chest rose and fell like I was drowning. Because to them, I was just another grieving granddaughter. No one knew that I had been betrayed in plain sight. That was the moment I hit my lowest point. Not just because of Gerald's hand. Not just because of Margaret's silence. But because I realized I was completely alone. The people who were supposed to protect me, my aunt, my family, the adults around me, had seen, had heard, had chosen not to act. The silence in that room was louder than any scream I could have made. I remember pressing my back against the wall, trying to steady myself as the crowd thinned. My body trembled, my breath shallow. My mind spun. Should I tell my father? Would he believe me? Or would he, like Margaret, tell me to keep the peace? The thought hollowed me out. I walked outside into the crisp air, the sky gray and heavy with clouds. The cemetery stretched out before me, rows of stones standing silent. People gathered around my grandfather's grave, their voices low, their movements choreographed in the dance of grief. Gerald stood among them, his hand resting casually on Margaret's shoulder, his face somber. No one would ever guess what he had done. No one would guess what she had allowed. I felt invisible, useless. But beneath that despair, something else stirred. Something sharper than fear. Seed. I didn't have words for it then. I only knew that silence had been forced on me, that my voice had been buried with my grandfather, that I had been told to keep the peace, while my uncle smirked and my aunt smoothed her skirt. But deep inside, beneath the shame and the terror, a promise took root. One day I thought, one day I will not keep the peace. One day I will make them pay. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? The words keep the peace haunted me for years. When I was young, they silenced me. They echoed whenever I tried to speak, whenever I wanted to shout the truth. I would open my mouth and hear Margaret's voice in my head, smooth and commanding, pressing down on me like a hand over my lips. But as I grew older, the words shifted. They hardened. They transformed from a command into a reminder of how betrayal hides in silence, how appearances protect the guilty, how peace without truth is nothing but rot. And with each year that passed, the seed inside me grew. At 16, I replayed that day at the funeral over and over. Each detail burned into memory. Gerald's hand on my knee, Margaret's eyes locking with mine, her whisper like poison. I told myself, don't forget. Don't let them bury this. At 20, I had opportunities to leave it behind. College. New towns. New faces. But every time I sat in a classroom or a cafe, every time I laughed with friends or went on a date, I felt the shadow of that silence. It followed me, whispering that my voice didn't matter, that peace was more important than truth. And then I realized something. I could not move on until I made them hear me. Revenge became not just a thought but a mission. Began to plan. Not in rash outbursts. Not in dramatic confessions. No, my revenge needed to be like theirs. Deliberate, careful, sharpened by time. Gerald and Margaret had used silence as a weapon. I would use truth. But truth delivered at the right moment, in the right way, where no one could look away. The first step was patience. I waited. I watched. I kept track of their lives the way a detective collects evidence. Gerald grew fatter with age, but his charm never dimmed. He told stories at family gatherings, slapped backs, cracked jokes that made people roar. Margaret aged into a woman whose hair stayed perfectly coiled, whose skirts were always pressed, who spoke in polite tones that masked steel underneath. Together, they maintained the illusion of respectability. But I knew. And I kept records. I wrote down every story Gerald told, every exaggeration, every lie. I noted how Margaret shielded him when rumors swirled, how she changed the subject with practiced grace. I collected details like stones, heavy but necessary. The second step was strength. For years I carried shame like a weight. But as I aged, I realized shame did not belong to me. It belonged to them. They had chosen silence. They had chosen betrayal. And so, I began to reclaim myself, piece by piece. Therapy wasn't common in my day, but I sought it anyway. I told a counselor fragments of the truth, careful and slow. Speaking out loud was like forcing open a rusted door, painful but freeing. I began to write more. Essays, journals, letters I never sent. My words sharpened into weapons, honed by clarity. The third step was choosing the stage. I knew I wanted revenge not in private whispers but in public revelation. It couldn't happen in a church. That would be too neat, too expected. No, it needed to be somewhere that mirrored the betrayal, somewhere they cared most about appearances. That's when the opportunity presented itself. A family reunion. Every 5 years, the Carvers gathered in a rented hall, tables spread with casseroles and cakes, photographs displayed on easels, children running between chairs. It was always Gerald at the center, telling stories of the past, raising toasts, commanding attention. Margaret orchestrated it like a general, ensuring the food was plentiful, the speeches on time, the family image pristine. It was perfect. A banquet of appearances. A room filled with relatives who believed in family above all. The same people who had smiled through cracks for decades. I decided that would be the place. I began preparing in secret. I dug out my journals, pages yellowed but words still sharp. I gathered witnesses, cousins who remembered Margaret's hushes, neighbors who had once whispered suspicions. I made copies of everything, tucked them into folders, sealed them in envelopes. I practiced speaking aloud, not with rage but with precision. I wanted my words to slice, not stumble. I wanted to hold their silence up like a mirror and make them choke on their own reflection. And as the reunion drew closer, my determination solidified. I would walk into that hall, face Gerald and Margaret in front of everyone, and I would not keep the peace. I would shatter it. The night before the reunion, I sat at my desk, my journals spread out before me. My hands trembled slightly, not with fear but with anticipation. Decades of silence had led here. Decades of shame, betrayal, anger. Tomorrow I would speak. Tomorrow the silence would die. And as I closed the last journal, smoothing its worn cover, I whispered into the quiet. You told me to keep the peace. Tomorrow, Margaret, tomorrow, Gerald. I'll make sure you never know peace again. Real quick, subscribe and share your thoughts below before we get to the part that still makes my heart race. The family reunion hall buzzed with the usual noise of laughter, clinking dishes, and the shuffle of chairs on linoleum floors. The smell of casseroles and baked hams filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of iced tea. On the surface, it was a day like all the others. Smiles painted on faces, stories exchanged, photographs passed from hand to hand. But underneath, my heart pounded with a rhythm older than I was willing to admit. Decades of silence had brought me here. Decades of shame and betrayal and whispered commands to keep the peace. Tonight peace would die. Gerald was, as always, the center of attention. He stood at the head of the room, glass of punch in hand, booming voice carrying across the tables. To the Carvers, he declared, his smile wide, his charm effortless. A family with strong roots, stronger bonds, and a future as bright as its past. Applause rang out. Glasses clinked. Margaret stood beside him, poised and perfect, her lipstick immaculate, her posture straight as a rod. She nodded approvingly, her eyes scanning the room like a queen surveying her court. And then her gaze brushed mine. For the briefest moment, her smile faltered. Perhaps she recognized something in my eyes. Something sharper, harder, dangerous. I rose from my seat slowly, deliberately, clutching the folder I had brought. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. I have something to say, I announced, my voice carrying clear and strong. A ripple of curiosity swept the room. Gerald chuckled, spreading his arms. Of course, Linda. Always welcome to share. He expected me to tell a fond story, perhaps about our grandfather or family dinners long past. But my words had been honed too carefully for sentiment. I walked to the front, set the folder on the table, and faced the crowd. Family, I began, is supposed to mean protection, loyalty, truth. But sometimes family means silence. And silence can be the loudest betrayal of all. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Margaret's smile tightened. Gerald's brow furrowed. His confidence faltering for the first time. I opened the folder. Pages spilled across the table. Photocopied journal entries, typed statements, records. My hand trembled slightly, but my voice did not. Decades ago, at our grandfather's funeral, I was a child sitting in the front row. And Gerald, our Gerald, your charming storyteller, put his hand on me. He violated the very sanctity of mourning with his cruelty. Gasps erupted. Cousin dropped her fork. Someone whispered, "No." And Margaret, I continued, my eyes locking on hers, saw. She saw it all. And when I tried to speak, do you know what she told me? She told me to keep the peace, to protect appearances. To stay silent so the family wouldn't be embarrassed. The words hung in the air, heavy as stones. Gerald sputtered. "This is ridiculous. Lies." He turned to the room, his voice desperate. "You all know me." But the silence that followed was not the silence of support. It was the silence of suspicion, of doubt long buried, of cracks finally widening. I held up one of my journals, pages yellowed with age. I wrote it down. Every detail, every silence, every time Margaret smoothed her skirt instead of speaking. "You told me to keep the peace, Margaret. But all you really did was keep me in chains." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone to rescue her. No one moved. Gerald lunged forward, his hand slamming on the table. "Enough," he roared. But his voice cracked, his mask slipping. And that was when I struck the final blow. "You call this family strong," I said, turning to the room. "But strength built on silence is rot. You toasted roots and bonds, Gerald. But your roots are poisoned, and your bonds are chains. And tonight I break them." I slid the copies of my evidence across the tables, into the hands of cousins, nephews, nieces. Their faces paled as they read, as whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Gerald's voice rose again, desperate. "She's making this up. She's—" "Stop," a cousin snapped, standing. His face was red, his fists clenched. "I remember that day. I remember how quiet Margaret got. I remember the way Linda looked. Don't you dare call her a liar." The room turned. One by one, heads nodded, voices murmured agreement. The silence that had protected them all for decades collapsed under the weight of truth. Gerald's face crumpled, his charm shattered. Margaret's hands shook, her perfect composure unraveling. I stood tall, my voice steady. "You told me to keep the peace. Tonight I've done the opposite. I've shattered it. And you will never hide behind it again." The room erupted, shouts, tears, accusations. Margaret sank into a chair, her face pale, her lipstick smudged. Gerald stormed toward the exit, his shoulders hunched, his once commanding figure reduced to a broken silhouette. I gathered my journals, my hands steady now. I had spoken. I had forced them all to hear. As I walked out into the night air, the stars sharp above, I felt lighter than I had in 40 years. Not healed. Healing is its own journey, but free. Because silence had been their weapon. And truth at last had been mine. They thought silence would save them. My uncle thought his charm could erase what he did. My aunt thought reputation was more important than truth. And for 4 years, they carried on as if nothing happened. But the day I finally spoke, their peace collapsed in front of everyone they cared about. So, remember this. Silence does not protect the innocent. It protects the guilty. And one day, every silence will be broken. If this story gripped you, if you believe no voice should ever be buried, then join me here. Subscribe to the channel, share these stories, and help make sure the world never forgets. Truth will always be louder than silence.